My God.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of this from
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who...
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes! We've got a person, we got winners, give them a round of applause!
With some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
the combat system, the area control. So it's quite a complex system.
My God.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of this from
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who...
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes! We've got a person, we got winners, give them a round of applause!
with some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
the combat system, the area control. So it's quite a complex system.
My God.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of this from
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who...
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes! We've got a person, we got a winner, let's give them a round of applause!
With some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
the combat system, the barrier control. So it's quite a complex system.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of places from them.
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who...
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes! We've got a person, we got a winner, let's give them a round of applause!
with some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
the combat system, the barrier control. So it's quite a complex system.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of places from them.
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who...
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes! We've got a person, we got a winner, let's give them a round of applause!
with some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
the combat system, the barrier control. So it's quite a complex system.
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of places from them.
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who
Number 9 of 20, whose phone's gonna ring? Oh, yes, we've got a person, we got winners, give them a round of applause.
Now with some accent, but now most of you think you're from Greece, so I don't have to pretend that I have an accent. I can speak Greek English, okay? And now we can continue to
The car system, the barrier control. So it's quite a complex system. So
It's really cool. Like I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot of this.
Okay? And now, clap your hands.
I definitely had a blast and would recommend coming to this event the next time it's on. I'm not sure when they'll be on next, but it is a really good event to meet people who
Number
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CityJS live stream. I'm here with Kyle. My name is Dan. I'll be your host today. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Yeah, it's good for you to be here. Whereabouts are you tuning in from?
I hail from Austin, Texas, over in the United States.
Cool. Nice. So it's nice and hot there then.
We are in the midst of, or just coming out of a huge, generational ice storm that took down like half the trees in the city. So
Wow.
we are quite more chilly right now, but generally in the summer, yes, we are much hotter.
Awesome. So Carl has an upcoming talk, CityJS, on the 31st of March in London. And your talk is titled A Tale of Two Webs. So in today's live stream, we're going to dive into that talk a little bit, dive into Carl as well, and then discuss the web as it is today. So I did a little bit of research on you, Carl, and you put on your socials and your website that you're fighting for the people behind the pixels. And what does that mean exactly, and how did you get to that position?
Yeah, so I think it's not a novel or particularly insightful thing to point out that we as human beings can sometimes treat each other not so great when we put the abstraction of the computer, the screen, the internet, social media profiles, avatars, all of that stuff in between us. It starts to dehumanize this process. And I've been a fairly public figure in the JavaScript space and in the web space for going on 2 decades now. And I have seen my fair share of both the goods and the bads of this. And I came up with this phrase, the people behind the pixels, many years ago, to kind of remind me and hopefully remind other people of the importance of the human connection, all of this other stuff that we use to abstract and make the connection. Like right now, we're going through several different pieces of software so that we can talk to each other. My camera and video and all, my audio, it's all being routed through and processed, and we're live streaming and it's going through people's devices. There's so much abstraction that we already create. And the point of all of that is that we're supposed to be more connected, and therefore we should be able to be more human with each other. But I think we often forget that. So it's really just sort of a reminder that whatever you fire off, whatever you read from someone, it's not really that you're talking to the GPT robots of the world. You really are mostly talking to real human beings who have feelings, who have emotions, who have struggles and problems. And we need to remember that stuff, and remember that the person sitting next to you in the Zoom call or across from you, like we're doing here, that's a human being that has all of those same things, and different from you. They're in a different place. And we don't really know that and remember that as much as I think we should. So it's really just sort of a reminder of that, to keep the human connection in spite of all the other stuff that we put in between us.
That's an interesting point. So in terms of JavaScript developers and maybe teams that you've been in the past, have you found yourself being quite disconnected? And then what have you tried to do to engage that connection?
Yeah, I mean, disconnection is a perpetual problem. And I think we're 3 years on now from when the world changed and became in some ways more connected and in some ways more isolated than ever. I don't know how others listening in felt, but I certainly felt through the pandemic that deepening sense of isolation. Here I am in my recording studio, and it's soundproofed, and I've locked down my environment to have this like really nice, predictable window into the world. But I only experienced the world by looking at this camera for a couple of years. That's really all I ever got to experience. And fortunately now I have been able to get back out into the world and start reconnecting with people. And that felt so good the first couple of times that I was able to get back to a meetup or to a conference and really reconnect with people. That felt so good because for so long it had been isolating. But yeah, I think that we can't forsake the idea that even the best of technology that we develop, and I've certainly been part of trying to develop technology that allows us to use the internet and cameras and recordings and all of that sort of stuff, and even live. It's not the same as when you're interacting with a person. And so we need all of those things. We can't really replace them. We can't really automate away that human experience. That's why I'm so excited about, for example, coming over to London for the conference in a couple of months, because really reconnecting with people in the hallway and grabbing a drink with someone and sitting down to have a snack or whatever, all of those sorts of human experiences cannot be replicated through the computer. And that reminds us again how human we are, and how even though we may be thousands and thousands of kilometers apart, we're actually a lot closer. And it's a lot smaller of a community than maybe we realize. And so I'm really thankful that we get that opportunity to remind ourselves of that.
I think it's a great opportunity as well. What would you say to those developers and those engineers who, there's a big stereotype where as an engineer or developer, you're in front of a computer screen all day and maybe you're isolated. And how would you encourage, and what would you say to those developers to get them out there and get them going to these events and these meetups and having that human connection?
Yes, I think there's the consuming side and there's also the producing side. And I think both of those are part of the equation. The consuming side, of course, we've kind of trained ourselves to believe that all we really need to do is just sort of one-way download information. And so we've got all of these different platforms that have content and tutorials that we can read or that we can watch videos. And I don't mean to diminish any of those. I have many of my courses up on Front-End Masters, and a lot of people I think find benefit from platforms like that where you can get good solid content to learn from. But that is not a human connection. It's a one-way broadcast of information. Same thing with books. I've written a bunch of books, and I know that a lot of people have read and enjoyed those books, but I don't have any connection with the people that have read those books, other than the many hundreds and thousands that have actually reached out to me, which I'm always so thankful. Even when I get little, just a little message on LinkedIn or something like that, and somebody's like, I read your book and I liked it and it helped me, or I got a job. Like, those are so, they seem like they would just be trivial. And I have been so blessed to receive so many thousands of those kinds of messages from people all over the world. And there's so many people that I've never heard from, that only downloaded some information from one of my books or from one of my videos, right? So consuming, you might think, oh, all I need to do is just find the next best platform, the next best podcast, the next best video, YouTube channel to download that kind of information. But if you are not connecting back with that person in some way, if you're not taking the opportunity to connect back with that person, it becomes kind of this shallow, consumer only sort of experience. And you can get that from going to meetups. You can get that from going to conferences as well. But again, I feel almost, when I go to a conference and there are hundreds of people sitting in the audience and I maybe only talk to like a couple dozen of them, I always kind of yearn and I wish that there was more even engagement than that. And so I would encourage people that part of the benefit of going to a meetup, part of the benefit of going to one of these conferences is that you have that opportunity, and it's so much easier to connect with somebody and to chat with somebody. And the speakers at these events are not some, hidden cabal of people that are running everything. We're just human beings, and we're sitting there grabbing a drink and eating a snack just like anybody else, and come up and talk to people. So that's the consumption side that starts to reconnect back to the human experience. And then, of course, I believe that leads into and should lead into the producing side, meaning that every single person has an individual journey they're on. They have something that they're learning. And many of those people feel like they're not qualified, or maybe they're not expert enough, and that only the people that have been at this, or who have the titles, or have the the accolades, those are the only people that should really get up and present. And I don't think that's true at all, because it's definitely not true of me. I don't have any special accreditation that makes me more qualified to stand up and talk about JavaScript. The only thing that's different is that way back, I made an early bet that JavaScript was going to be a thing people wanted to know about, and there wasn't enough. There was a dearth, a lack of good information and good, solid information. There was lots of opinion about the language, but not a lot of good, solid kind of extrapolation of that into useful, practical knowledge. And so I just started asking questions about the language, and I wrote down what I learned, and then I started telling people what I was learning and trying to fit the pieces together. And that's it. There's no, I wasn't born with some kind of special privilege or backhand knowledge, backroom knowledge, or special secret access to JavaScript. I developed relationships with people who knew more about it than I did, and I just soaked that up, and I asked them, and I'm thankful that they were they were so kind and patient with me to answer so many of my questions early on. But I think that's what I'm getting at, is that's what the experience of being able to go to a meetup or a conference, that allows you to create those human connections where you can ask those questions, and then hopefully those questions turn into answers that you can provide to other people in your own voice, combined with your own experience. And you don't have to reach some level of mastery to do that. In fact, I always tell people, if you wait until you feel like you've mastered something, whatever that thing is that you've been learning, some plugin for React, or some, Vite process, or whatever. I don't even know what these things are, but like, I've heard these words bandied around. So I hear that Vite is, I hear Vite is cool. So I'm just throwing in that keyword to sound like I'm cool. I don't even know. I've never used it, but my point is, you might be like the person who's really dug in and really actually totally understands that thing. And you might combine some knowledge that you hear from somebody else with some of your experience, and you have something unique to share with the rest of us. And I would like to sit and listen to you talk about how Vite is really, really cool and why that is so important. And if you wait until you feel like you're that expert, you've waited too long, because all of us, and I include myself, even though I'm a speaker, I'm also an attendee, and I'm also somebody who wants to learn and hear from other people. And we miss out on the most important part when you hold back and say, oh, it's not ready. I'm not an expert. I'm not, qualified enough yet. The most important part is the journey that all of us want to connect to. And so I've tried to model that by just early and often sharing, and I hope other people can be inspired to do the same. That doesn't mean that I endorse just putting out, junk, putting out total misinformation. But I don't think that you have to present information only after you've had it verified and checked by all the academics or whatever. You can put out something and say, this is what I understand right now, and I might be wrong, and if I am, please help me, please correct me, put a comment to something that'll help me explain this better, whatever. I think if we did more of that, it would tear down some of these walls of the us versus them, and I'm in this community and you're in that community and we don't really see eye to eye. If we just all said, we're just figuring it out. It's messy. I don't know all of the answers, but I'm asking good questions, and here's what I've figured out so far. That's, I think, one of the best parts of the meetup and the conference and that sort of experience, that human connection experience. So we get the chance to do that. And that certainly it changed the whole trajectory of my career, because I was so fortunate to be able to do that so many years ago.
So there's interesting points you said about, being human. Obviously, we are all human, I hope so, behind the screen. And I know that you speak a lot about being an imposter and how imposter syndrome affects all of us as well. And so what would you say to those people who have something to share? And I've been in this position before, but they feel like an imposter and they don't want to share because they don't want to, look bad, or they don't want to look silly or anything like that. How can an individual overcome that barrier? And share their knowledge with the world?
Yeah, I was doing for about a year or so, the most recent talk that I had been giving before this new one that I've developed was Confessions from an Imposter. And I think a lot of people had an interesting reaction to that, because they never assumed or never even really wanted to believe that someone in my position, who has been in this more visible role in our community, could feel those same sorts of feelings. And what I was hoping to do was to disarm some of that by saying, hey, look at all of these different things that I do on a day-to-day basis. I use the web technologies just like everybody else. I don't have any special access to any magical process. I use the same things, and I write the same kinds of bugs that everybody else does, and I bang my head against the keyboard the same as everybody else, maybe even more. I struggle with these sorts of things. And so I just wanted to share that experience with other people and say, even though I'm still struggling to more master XYZ technology, and JavaScript included, I don't consider myself to have mastered or an expert at that. Even though I'm still getting better at those technologies, I did not wait around until I was an expert before trying to use those technologies to put my voice out there. And that's one of the best parts of the web, is that it allows us to just create an experience for somebody else, or hopefully a lot of other people, to be able to experience. We can create those kinds of engagements and interactions because of what we know. It's sort of this superpower that we know a little bit of these technologies, and we know just how to kind of wire these things together, and we create something that somebody on the other side of the world can almost instantaneously experience. That is still mind-blowing to me, and it's still so powerful to me. And I reflect back on my background. I have an education in computer science, and I reflect back on what I was being taught 25 years ago in the classroom, when I was learning about all the formal backgrounds behind computer science. And I don't mean to diminish any of that. I actually love that stuff, but I don't think that they understood at that time. We definitely didn't understand what the web was going to become. And I don't think we could possibly have imagined how empowering the web would become through these technologies, that with a little bit of effort and a little bit of learning, you become an equal in this world in terms of your ability to create something. I mean, we see things from people post a code pen with some a kind of amazing CSS animation or whatever. And that person, we've never heard of them before. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, can you please come and talk about that at this meetup or this conference, how you figured out how to do whatever that thing is. I mean, it's still amazing to me, and it's still empowering to me to believe that those stories are still happening. They're still possible. I think the web really is one of the best creations that mankind has ever come up with. It comes with a lot of problems. And I'm sure we'll get into my talk here in a little bit about some of those problems, but the best part of the web, I think, is that it still lets us do that kind of thing. It still lets us make that kind of an impact around the world instantaneously. And so, that's pretty cool. And I hope people will continue to do that and not, that's why I call myself an imposter, because I just started trying to do that. Yeah. I onboarded into the web in the days when the way you learned about how to do web technology was you right-clicked on a page and you did view source, and you looked at how somebody else did it, and you figured out how to do it. And we don't use view source so much anymore. And I think maybe a little bit to our detriment that we've created a lot of abstraction where that isn't possible. But the 2023 version of that is I saw somebody's code pen and I looked through their source code to figure out how they created that amazing experience. And then I tried to replicate some portion of that in whatever I was trying to build. That magic is still there. It just looks a little different, and there's a few more steps, unfortunately. But the point is still that we can learn from each other and then become producers in this amazing medium, and I that's magical to me.
Do you have any platforms that you would recommend people starting out on, whether it be like a blog post on Medium or Twitter? If they've got something to share, where do you recommend them to go?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic content producers. It would be hard to list only some of them, but I'll speak from the perspective of someone who already feels pretty comfortable with JavaScript. Some of the technologies that I am still trying to get better at and have a long way to go at are things like HTML and CSS. So I gravitate more to resources in those spaces. Whereas with JavaScript, most of what I need to know, I've already kind of learned. And so there's maybe fewer of those resources that I'm reading or following. There are some great JavaScript folks out there. Axel Rauschmeier, the Tuality, 2ALITY, I think is his blog. And he's unbelievably smart and writes just such great content about JavaScript. So there's good stuff there. But like, I look to the producers in the other spheres of web technology, the spaces where I know less and I need to learn more. And Chris Coyer, the guy who created CodePen, he was the founder of that. And he's got blogs, CSS Tricks, which I guess he doesn't run that anymore, but forever and ever I read. There's tons of good information on CSS Tricks, css-tricks.com or whatever that is. But that's a fantastic. I mean, I still Google and pull up the CSS Grid and the CSS Flexbox articles that he produced on there. Those are just so fantastic. So those are things that I gravitate towards. Smashing Mag, they're another group that does a lot in CSS, and I've read a ton of their stuff. So, I look to those kinds of resources. But those are few off the top of my head that have just consistently, year after year, for decades now, produced amazing content in their spheres, and that's what I've learned a ton from those.
So you talk about CSS. I mean, we have a saying here in the UK that's it's like Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. And I've seen that in the dev community as well. And what's your personal opinion on CSS? Do you like using it? And how do you get along with it?
Yeah, I it's an interesting question because it's not the technology that I chose to dig in and learn at as deep a level as I chose with JavaScript. And so for me, I'm a drive-by experience with CSS, meaning that I know enough to kind of get by and enough to, I think, be somewhat productive with it, but I'm not at I'm not at the level of someone like Leah Veru, who is certainly one of the world's foremost experts on CSS. I read her book and the blog posts and other things that she does and conference talks that she does because she knows that space so well, and she's part of the standards process. And I don't know it at that level, and so for me, I wouldn't say that I feel a ton of confidence in what I can accomplish with CSS. It falls into that realm of what I was just talking about it's I should have said that in my talk about Confessions from an Imposter. What I was really trying to encourage people to do was embrace the idea that that's an identity that you don't have to be scared or ashamed of, but that you can just, wear that like a cape. That's my superpower, is that I can do something on the web without being an expert at CSS. I can piece together just enough of it to get something out there. And then hopefully other people that know it better will stop by and say, hey, if you did this, be better or whatever. Like that's the superpower. And we should embrace that identity of being an imposter. So CSS is one of those spaces where I fully call myself an imposter because I kind of understand Flexbox and Grid and some of these other things. And I use CSS custom properties or CSS variables. I use those a lot. And I feel like I can get some stuff done in CSS, but I am super old school in that I write CSS in a .css file, and I use CSS syntax. And there's this huge ecosystem of, I'll call them abstractions or different thoughts on CSS. My personal take is I feel like a lot of people have been frustrated by their either lack of understanding or their lack of ability to do something that they wanted to do with CSS. And I think rather than embracing that messiness and digging into that and learning that, I think they tried to bring the JavaScript programmer perspective to the CSS world. And so we've created all of this extra layers of abstraction, this styled components and all these, which are fantastic, by the way. I don't mean to say anything bad about them. The people that have created these libraries and these abstractions are incredibly smart to have figured all that stuff out. But I do think it kind of represents this, like, I don't want to write CSS. I want to write JavaScript and let CSS sort of be created for me. That mindset, I'm not so sure is so helpful or healthy. So I'm super old school about it. And when I write CSS, I open up a new file with a .css extension, and that's where I put my stuff. So I don't know if I can say a lot of what the modern CSS is, because almost nobody does that anymore. Almost everybody's doing it in these other abstractions.
So let's get on to JavaScript. So why did you pick JavaScript? You said that you started 20 years ago and you was at university, and why JavaScript and why not any other language that was around at that time? What made you place your chips on JavaScript?
Yeah, I wish I knew the one singular answer to that question. It was a set of very lucky, I think informed but lucky guesses. I was informed in the sense that I could tell even by the late 90s and the early 2000s that the internet, that the web, which at that time was pretty nascent, it was still becoming a thing, but you could tell that by the time that there was a .com boom around 2000 or whatever, businesses had thrown in and they had said, hey, the web is this thing we should invest heavily in. And I could tell that there was going to be a desire for the web to be an interactive place rather than simply a static information kind of medium. And it was clear to me that JavaScript was going to be a player in that. It was not clear to many other people. In fact, I think most people at the time felt like JavaScript was not going to be the answer. And you saw all kinds of companies for years and years and years coming along and saying, no, this is going to be the thing. We had, Macromedia, and then Adobe bought that, and they were like, Flash is going to be the way that interactivity on the web happens. And we have Microsoft with their .NET Silverlight experience. That's going to be that. We had Java even before that with Java plugins, and there's a half dozen others that were coming along and saying the web technology doesn't have the capability to create these interactive experiences. So here's this other technology sandbox, this black box of technology that will create that. And I think the web that we have today in 2023 is that way largely because those companies kind of pioneered what could we do, what could we experience through a web browser that the web technology at the time couldn't do, and it needed to play catch up. But I kind of believed all along that even though we saw these other companies doing these different things, I kind of believed that those would just be the playbook that the web platform technology would catch up to and would learn from, because I think what we've seen throughout most of human history is that the open and collaborative efforts kind of always tend to win in the long run. In the short run, the closed proprietary ecosystems almost always get a head start. They have the big companies and the big backers, and there's the benefit of the lock-in or whatever. And that's why those earlier front runners kind of jumped out ahead. But in the long run, what was going to survive was not one company's corporate agenda for what the web should be, but what we could all collectively agree on what the web should be. And that turned out to be the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. And it didn't turn out to be whatever Adobe was cooking up or whatever Microsoft was cooking up or whatever this company or this company was cooking up. It turned out to be this hodgepodge of all of the other things that the rest of the world could all agree on. And so I sensed that was where the early bets, it was a long bet, but that those early bets were going to pay off. And so in the early 2000s, that's where I chose to put a lot of my effort to try to learn and understand that. And I was fortunate that I had some jobs that allowed me to kind of specialize in JavaScript. And so I just spent a lot of time really digging in and trying to understand that technology better and trying to write thing. I did some very early versions of open source before there was a GitHub. There was like these other places like SourceForge and stuff like that you could like release your code. And I'm super dating myself at this point, but like that's in 2005 and 2006, I was trying to like, here's some stuff I figured out, and I was trying to push it out there. In 2007, I pushed out my first like big open source project, which ironically that was a JavaScript library wrapped around Flash. It was using Flash, but it was doing it in a different way than a lot of others. So I was trying to solve cross-domain AJAX, making communications from the browser to the server before we had cores, before we had the ability for AJAX to do that. Flash actually had the ability to do cross-domain communication. They had this whole like this policy file thing that you could do. And so like, I think it was like 2006, I was like, well, what if I made an invisible 1x1 pixel Flash file, and I wrapped a JavaScript library around it that looked like XML HTTP request, the original AJAX thing. It looked like that. It behaved like that. It had all the same properties and methods, but under the covers, it just used this invisible Flash file to do the cross-domain communication. That was called Flexer, FLXHR. Is this on your
GitHub now as well?
I think I like at some point, because obviously Flash is not even a thing anymore.
Yeah.
At some point, I think I like spun that out into its own GitHub account and just left all that code out there in the public domain or whatever. I don't even remember what happened with it. If people like Googled it, you might find some old references to FLXHR and to Flexer. But anyway, that was like the first thing that I ever built that I was like, I'm just going to push this out there. And that actually got me some of my earliest opportunities to like talk at conferences around like 2008 and 2009 was some of the stuff that I had done there. So I just started pushing those things out. I built after Flexer, the thing that most people found out about me about was a library that I wrote called Lab.js, which was a dynamic script loader for loading scripts dynamically in the background and kind of piecing them all together and controlling when and in what order they ran. in those days, we wanted to optimize the web by loading things dynamically rather than packaging everything into one single file like we do now. And so dynamic resource loading was kind of a big hot thing for a while. And so I wrote one of the first big high profile ones that was used by, you know, a bunch of sites like Twitter and Zappos and Vimeo and some places like that. So that kind of put me on the map in the open source world, but it wasn't the first. The first thing I had done was a few years earlier with Flexer. But.
So throughout the history of JavaScript, apologize to be dating you here, but you've been through it all. And what would you say is some of the pivotal moments in JavaScript's history? Like what features of the language or the browser have been implemented that have really shaped the language to where it is today?
I think the first big inflection point for JavaScript was really strict mode in ES5, actually technically ES 5.1. So that was like 2011-ish when that kind of started to land. I think there were a lot of other inflection points that influenced JavaScript. For example, Firefox, Mozilla building the Firefox browser to compete against and to kind of take the reins back from Microsoft that had stagnated with IE6. That wasn't a JavaScript change, but it was an ecosystem level change that revived JavaScript. So we could talk about those kinds of things, but if we're talking about only the language itself and the things that it's gone through, if I focus on language features, I would say that strict mode was kind of a huge pivotal point for the language, because we started realizing that to take the language seriously, we were going to need to be a bit more disciplined about what we wrote, and that not all JavaScript that you can write is JavaScript that you should write. It, as a general purpose language, it can do anything, and there's some things that we will be more successful at than others. I'm trying to be political about it because I don't really like to step in and tell people, that's wrong, you shouldn't do it that way. But like strict mode was basically an admission that there were things that JavaScript allowed which we really probably shouldn't be doing. Mostly not like we shouldn't be doing it because it's like morally or ethically wrong or anything like that, but just like if you do this, it's going to make your code slower. So maybe don't do that. And if you don't do that and you adhere to the strict mode thing. So I think that was a big pivotal moment. It was a tough pill to swallow for the world, but I'm thankful now that it's sort of, you don't hear people having to talk about let's write strict mode anymore. It's kind of assumed. I think when ES6 came along, it basically formalized the idea that strict mode was the future of the language, because classes and modules are the two biggest code organization techniques in the language right now, and both of them are automatically strict mode. So that settled the whole question of, are we strict mode or not, or is this an optional thing? It's just like, no, absolutely everything we do is in strict mode. So that was a big deal. I think ES6 was another big turning point for the language, because we recognized that many other languages had shifted in the spectrum between imperative style coding, and declarative style coding, which really is a spectrum. It's not a binary. There's no such thing as this is imperative, this is declarative. It's a spectrum. But many of the other languages of the day had already made that shift to more declarative, because that had proven a lot of benefits in terms of code maintenance and the ability to like collaborate with other people on code. And JavaScript had lagged behind, and it was kind of playing the catch-up game. But many of the features that we now take for granted in JavaScript weren't there until ES6. And that was kind of like this really painful change set where we had to break a lot of people's habits. And even now today, people are still trying to learn, I'm talking about things like destructuring. We take that for granted now as if that has always been the thing, but no, it very much was not the thing for like 20 years of JavaScript. And so we got some improvements to our ability to write understandable and more maintainable code. And I think those are some of the big hallmarks, but we could probably pick out a dozen other good and bad things that JavaScript's done along the way.
Tell me some of the bad things you think that this has been adopted by JavaScript, the language, or also the browser as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how long do we have? We could talk for ages about some of
Pick the
the
first one.
bad things. There's one feature that JavaScript recently landed, which I don't usually say this about features. There are features that JavaScript has where I'm like, I don't like it. I don't use it, but I'm fine if others use it. And then there's these rare few gems where I'm like, no. I'm willing to say this is just objectively bad and wrong, and you should just never do it. That's a small list. I don't like to get that absolute about stuff, but I'll put one in that bucket, and that is so we know about optional chaining, the little question mark dot thing.
Yeah.
I love that feature. I think that's cool and helpful. By the way, there are other ways of doing that, but I'm glad that JavaScript has that feature built into it. And I'm happy that people use it, and I use it as well. Maybe not all the time, but I use it when it's appropriate. But there was a little corner version of that feature that's the optional call syntax. And if you've seen the question mark dot and the parenthesis, those three characters together, question mark dot parenthesis, which is like it pretends as if it's going to protect a function call and not make the function call if the function's not defined or it's not, a callable function.
So would that just return undefined?
Right. So the optional call syntax skips the function call and just, nulls out to undefined or whatever it returns. That feature, I'm just convinced that was like the worst thing that JavaScript could have done. I've written a bunch of different things about why, and we don't have to get into all the nitty gritty, but it pretends as if what it's doing is protecting you against a thing that you're trying to call that's not callable. That's what it looks like. It looks like, because there are languages that have like these safe call operators. I think PHP or something. They have these operators where you protect yourself against trying to call something that's not callable. But it turns out that this question mark dot parenthesis thing, the optional call operator, I think is what it's referred to, that it's not protecting you from any other thing other than null and undefined. All of the other non-callable values are still going to throw errors. And so it looks as if it's giving you the safety that it's not, and it's masquerading as this thing that it's not really. And I already hear everybody listening yelling at me that the answer to that question is TypeScript, right? And that is a big thing right now, is that everybody thinks that we shouldn't even be writing JavaScript, we should be writing TypeScript. I think that's a predominant feeling in our industry. I think that if you're going to talk about JavaScript as a language, and I really think we should talk about TypeScript as a different language. I don't think we should think about TypeScript as a better JavaScript or anything. It's a different language that I think bizarrely chose JavaScript as its like inspiration point. Like if you're setting out to start a new language, I'm not sure that you should start with JavaScript as the language to try to, be your inspiration point and your changing point. But anyway, it's a separate language, right? So that's fine if you like TypeScript. I'm not, I don't personally use it, but I'm not saying anything bad about anybody that has found it to be useful for them. I'm glad that exists in the ecosystem. But when you start adding features to JavaScript, a different language, and you start justifying that the only proper and good and safe way to use this JavaScript feature is if you're also using TypeScript, to me, we've gone completely off the rails at that point. Yeah. You can't justify a JavaScript feature by the absence or presence of another language or a tool set like TypeScript. It should be able to prove itself as useful in JavaScript without needing TypeScript to make it safe or good. So for me, that's why it falls, not just in the, I don't love it, into this is not good. We should not have done this. And so I actually wrote a lint rule for ESLint to just forbid
it all, right?
To forbid the optional call operator. And a bunch of people flamed me. They didn't like that I did that, because I think some people like this feature, but that's one of those that I think it's unconditionally bad.
I agree with you. I think, if a function's there in your code, you're going to know where it is as well, right? And you're not going to have these arbitrary functions just coming towards you unless you're using a library. But it's quite a bizarre scenario to not know if something's a function or not.
I think that's true. And I also think that if you write code in such a way where something could be a string or could be a function, that's probably a code smell. You probably shouldn't be doing that. There's a lot of polymorphism that we can benefit from, but like crossing data type streams like that is maybe not the greatest idea. But maybe there's a totally valid reason why this variable could hold a string or it could hold a function or whatever. But that's why we have things like the type of operator to absolutely check, is this thing a function before I call it? We should not be like short circuiting out like, oh, if it's a like non-empty string, then I'll use it. And otherwise then that's not good coding practice. And you don't need to be a TypeScript aficionado to say, you shouldn't treat a string as if it's a function or vice versa. Those just shouldn't mix. And that's not a TypeScript statement. That's a programming logic statement. You shouldn't mix those two. And the other thing I would say is, this is probably the biggest thing that jumped off the page at me. This is back when they were considering the proposal for this feature. And I was like, oh, I hate this feature. I hope they don't do it. I argued against it. They didn't listen, but I argued against it. And the biggest reason for me is like, in what scenario do I have a thing that if it's a function call, I want its return value, but if it's not been defined as a function, then it's okay for the result of that to just be the undefined value. That's never, like, I always want some other default. If the function isn't defined, there's always some other default value that I want for that. Whether if it's a number, then I want it to be 0. If it's a string, I want it to be the empty string. I never want it to be undefined. And so the fact that we use this operator and we pave over the fact that you skipped a function call and you just get back the undefined value instead of calling that function, I hardly ever write functions where the result of the function would ever be the undefined value. Like, I'm a functional programmer, functional programming advocate. You don't write functions that return undefined. So that operator is just like the biggest smell that I've ever seen. And I just think there's no virtue in using it.
So talking about null and undefined, I've followed Crockford before in the past. And I remember him saying about one of the flaws in the language is that there's 2 bottom values, null and undefined. And what's your opinion on that? Should JavaScript just have one? I mean, it's obviously difficult to remove it now, but how do you find about working with null and undefined?
So first of all, it's not only difficult to remove, it's literally impossible. The charter of JavaScript, and it's debatable whether it's a good idea, but JavaScript has this notion of forever backwards compatible, meaning that code that you wrote in 1995 still runs in JavaScript engines today. I think maybe we should, think about abandoning that notion at this point. But, that's part of the charter of the language, is that it's going to stick with all of its old bad mistakes. And so null and undefined are, if they're a mistake, they're a mistake that we're stuck with forever. We're not ever going to get away from that. They're not going to create another like stricter mode where they get rid of it or what. That's a fantasy, right? So it's a reality in JavaScript. If you're going to write JavaScript, you need to understand that you could have either of these 2 different values. Some people like to assign different meaning to one versus the other. And in fact, some JavaScript features treat them differently. And then other JavaScript features treat them indistinguishably. So we were just talking about optional call and optional chaining and whatever. That set of operators, and there was like 3 or 4 different ones that are kind of all of that same ilk. That set of operators deliberately tries to treat null and undefined as indistinguishable. It's called null-ish, meaning null or undefined. Either way, we're going to do the same thing, right? That I actually support that. Again, I think that, for example, optional chaining, I think that's a good thing. And I do generally try to treat those 2 values as indistinguishable, meaning if it's null or it's undefined, it means the same thing to me, which is it's unset. It does not currently have a valid value. And I'll use null or undefined kind of interchangeably there. unfortunately, JavaScript has other features where it does distinguish between them. Most notably, the like in the destructuring and parameter in default clauses, in destructuring or in arguments, function parameters, the default clause only kicks in for undefined, but not for null. That's stupid. Like JavaScript is like this, like they had an opportunity to just pick one horse and go with it. Are we going to treat them as indistinguishable, or are we going to treat them as separate things? And we went down the route of treating them as both. And that's chaos. And so that's unfortunate. I've tried to propose, for example, we use the equal sign for the default clause in destructuring and parameter names. And I tried to propose, what if we had the question mark equals that did the same defaulting but was nullish, so we could get away from this whole like distinguishing between the two? Because if we're going to put in question mark dot and question mark dot parenthesis and all the question all these other ones that are nullish, we ought to have the default thing fit the same behavior, so that we just agree across the board. JavaScript features treat null and undefined as indistinguishable. Let's just do that, right? We've got the double equals operator, which I know everybody loves to hate. I love the fact that double equals treats them as indistinguishable. I think that's a good feature of JavaScript. And so I like to do X double equal null, because then I can get away with that. But anyway, it should just all be one or the other. This kind of duality of things that we have to juggle in JavaScript is kind of, it contributes to the gray hairs that I have, I'll say. I wish that we had picked one side or the other with that, and it would be a whole lot easier for people to learn and teach the language if we didn't have to teach all of these different nuances.
It's an interesting point you made about destructuring. I didn't actually know that there was a difference there. I thought that JavaScript would just be consistent, but I guess we have these flaws.
Yeah, the default clause, whether it's in a destructuring or in a parameter, it's its own algorithm in the spec. And when they wrote that into ES6, they were still of the opinion that null and undefined should be treated differently. And then sometime post ES6, they're like, oh, actually, that was a terrible idea. We should not have treated them differently. But we're stuck forever with the default algorithm only paying attention to undefined.
Wow. So we're about halfway through, a little bit over, and we want to dive into your talk at CityJS. So that is on the 31st of March in London. Yeah. And the title is A Tale of Two Webs. So what does that mean? And, let's dive into that.
Yeah. So full disclosure to everybody watching here, especially if you're watching live, I came up with that title like 8 or 9 hours ago while I was struggling to go to sleep. So I had a different working title for this talk, and I finally decided just before my brain let me fall asleep last night that was the title. And I woke up this morning and immediately emailed Dan to say, there's a new title, and it's A Tale of Two Webs. Everybody, I'm sure, probably recognize, or most people probably recognize the Charles Dickens reference to A Tale of Two Cities. Obviously, that's where I'm going with this, and the talk will have some flavors of that. But this talk, I'm going to do something, I like to bring topics to the forefront that really make people uncomfortable and stretch the envelope and stretch the bounds of what we're talking about. And certainly over the last, I would say, 6 to 9 months of my evolution of the way that I look at the web and the way that I look at JavaScript and the way that I look at how all this fits together, I've gone through a pretty significant shift in perspective. And it's reflected in where I'm now working. I'm working for a company that is going to, I think, be at the forefront of authoring a change to the way we think about the web and the way we assemble and build the web. And so I found this group of folks, and I was like, so I'm working for a company called Socket Supply, and they build this runtime that I guess the closest match would be for people that have done Electron or other hybrid style apps where you build the app code in JavaScript and then there's some kind of native wrapper around it, WebView or whatever that's wrapped around it. It's kind of like that, except it's not Electron at all. First of all, it's not the huge 100 megabyte node thing wrapped around it. The socket runtime that wraps around your hybrid app is 1.5 megabytes at the moment. So it's really
Nice.
small and really thin. And socket runtime already runs on all the platforms. It runs on iOS, Android, Windows, Mac, and Linux. And that's different from all of the other ones as well. So you build an app using JavaScript technology, kind of like if you were building a React Native sort of app. You build an app using web technology. You compile it to all of those platforms. You create native apps. So that's what we do at Socket Supply. The other thing that Socket is doing, which is part of where I'm going with this Tale of Two Webs thing, the other thing that Socket is doing is basically saying, why do we have so many of these websites and these web apps and these apps that all need to talk back to these central servers in the cloud? We have the technology, we have the capability for app instances to talk directly to each other. And why don't we just cut out the middleman? Why don't we get rid of this idea that we need centralized servers in the cloud for everything? That doesn't mean that the cloud is going to go away. But what if the cloud, a few years from now, what if, let me personalize this to anybody that runs a business that pays a cloud bill. Whatever your cloud bill is, you pay $100 a month, $1,000 a month, $100,000 a month. I don't know what your cloud bill is. But what if that cloud bill was 1%? What if we knocked off 99% of your cloud bill? What would that change about your business model? Could you do different things with your business model if you could accomplish the same stuff without having to throw so much money at the cloud? And that's, I think, what is the big potential behind what Socket's doing, because they've built fully capable peer-to-peer networking protocol and APIs and put that into that Socket runtime. So using UDP, you can directly communicate with peers, and they have a whole protocol for the way packets transfer between peers and all that. There's a lot of really powerful stuff that I'll get more into my talk. But so the idea, first of all, that we can have a single JavaScript web tech kind of application wrapped around a very thin but powerful shell that runs on all the platforms. And by the way, those can all talk to each other so that you don't really need nearly as much of the cloud. You don't need to centralize all of that data storage. I think that represents a pretty significant shift for what we think about the web. So if we think about what the web is today versus what could the web be if something like Socket, or maybe there are other players, I'm sure, that will try to do things their own ways or whatever. But if we talk about this as a category of solutions, and I think Socket is kind of the first big success in this new direction, what does that mean? And I think we start to bifurcate the view of the web, and that's why I talk about this as out into the future. There's two different webs that could exist, and I hope that we go in one direction versus the other. So the big thing that I would say that to help summarize this, you need to come to my talk to understand more of it. But the big thing that I would help to say is that the web as it currently sits today is a continual kind of, it's like we keep packing more and more snow onto the snowball. We're making this bigger and bigger snowball. We keep accreting more and more complexity onto the web, because at the heart of it, what we're trying to do with web right now today is create full application experiences. I mean, you think about things like Figma and Gmail and stuff. These are full apps. This is not your mom and pop gardening static website. These are full apps. And I would argue that JavaScript developers are trying to make most of the web into apps with all the stuff they're doing with the frameworks and things like that. We're trying to make everything an app, right? But what the web is trying to do today is make everything an app, but still have it be that every time you visit the page, you re-download the whole damn app. And so we're trying to create megabytes and megabytes and megabytes worth of images and fonts and all of this animations and all of this logic and interaction and stuff, put it in this package and send it down to you and have it re-downloaded every single time you want to use the app. And that's just absurd. I cannot understand why the web thinks that why we think that the web should be like that. Like, it's this notion that We need to create these experiences, but we need for them to be instantly auto-updatable. Nowhere else in computing history have we ever had apps that were instantly auto-updated. But that's what we're basically trying to do. And if you look at what all of these kind of newest generation of frameworks, and I won't put React in that boat, even though they've done some new stuff. React's been around a long time. They're not a new generation app, but you look at some of the ones that have come along, like Solid and a few others that are out there. I could name and check several of these that I've seen conference talks on. I'm not an expert on any of these, right? So I shouldn't be the one that anybody asks any details about. But here's what I know is that they're taking different parts of the mechanisms by which code is executed, the mechanisms by which code is delivered, compiled, and executed. They're taking different parts of that pipeline and reinventing them in totally new and novel and quite impressive, by the way, ways, because they're trying to get around the fundamental fact that it's absurd to download an app over and over and over again, especially a giant app, because the whole, websites these days, I think the latest survey was like, we're now up to like almost 10 megabytes is the default size of web apps these days.
That's a lot of JavaScript.
It's insane,
Yeah.
right? Like you're trying to push all of this stuff down the pipe every single time you open up the app. Now, I know people will say, well, we've got the cache, and ideally we just cache everything, except there's a couple of decisions that we've made along the way that have basically made the cache that's an integral part of the web platform, but we've made the cache basically totally useless. The first thing that we did is that we started bundling everything into one giant freaking file. And then we said, well, it's not that big a deal. If I change 1 byte, then you need to download all 10 new megabytes worth of JavaScript. That's not a big deal. That's a huge deal. That's a big problem. We should never have done that. The whole notion of bundling is garbage. We should get rid of it. Everything should be individual resources so that you get the smallest incremental differential change that you can ship. Like if I have a 10 megabyte app and I change 1 kilobyte of that 10 megabyte app, I should only need to, if I'm going to instantly update, if that's the promise that we're trying to go after, then I should only instantly update the 1 kilobyte, not the whole 10 megabytes. And the notion that we've tried to reinvent like the entire stack, and I'm talking literally down to like computer science fundamentals, like what is a function call stack? Like that's a thing that the engine should be handling, but they went and reinvented it in React with fibers because they did not have enough control over the call stack. They needed to be able to do these like non-local continuations or whatever. Like we've just reinvented like this whole set of technology because we will not admit that it is absurd to try to reship the entire application on every page load. And we won't admit that what we should be thinking about is a different way of doing things. We should either be thinking about the web as when you go to a web, when you go to a web page, when you go to a web application, what you get at that moment is the last version of that you had fully downloaded from some time before, if you'd ever visited it before. And that requires us to have better usage of modern technology, like better usage of service workers that take control of the cache and actually do something intelligent with the way the cache works, instead of the craziness of the way caching headers work. If you had some logic in a service worker that intelligently cached that experience, and then somebody visits that experience for the second time, and they get the exact same bits that they had before, and then in the background, you're communicating back with the server and saying, hey, can you tell me just the bytes that have changed? Just give me those. I'll patch what I've got, and then I'll let the user know. Maybe I'll let the user know, or I'll just kind of silently push that in there to them. The next time they click a button or the next time they do something, we'll just kind of upgrade their experience as we go, right? Like that's how we ought to be doing it. Either that, or we should stop thinking about going to servers to get web experiences at all. And we should move to a web of installed apps. And it's that second web that is, I think, what is pointed to by things like socket supply, by the socket runtime, That's where I think the web needs to go. I think we need to go in the direction of build these apps, but let's just have everybody install them. Instead of going to web servers over and over and over again, let's just embrace what is actually great about web technology, but also what's great about app technology. Let's put those two things together, and let's create a web of installed apps.
So the first thing that comes... Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. That's all right. I was just going to finish the thought by saying, and the way that really works is when all of those installed apps can talk to each other. They don't need the central servers anymore. They can just talk to each other. It's a lot closer and a lot more efficient.
So the first thing that comes to mind with this is state in an application. Is this more of a movement in the way that we think about our applications, or is there a use case for using the cloud now, and then a use case for using socket supply? And could you give me a use case of like an application on one side of the fence?
Yeah. So I first of all, let me say that most of the data, and that word is not even granular enough because there's a lot of different things that data means, but most of the data that is currently transmitting around the internet is data that does not need to transmit around the internet. We're just transmitting it around the internet because we basically decided that the internet tubes, to sound like a really old fogey, that all the internet wires of the world are our state management, right? We'll just keep everything ephemerally in the collective transmission, and we'll serialize all of that state or the snapshots of that state in these giant cloud stores that we pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a second to maintain, right? That's what we basically decided, is that's the way that the web works, is we're going to have all of that state being transferred. Most of that doesn't need to be transferred in the first place. I would make that claim because most of the business models are based upon the reason why they want my data is not so that they can make it easy for my data to, for my social media. If I were to tweet something, I don't use Twitter anymore, but if I were to tweet something, or what's it called on Mastodon? Is it tooting or something? I don't know. Whatever it is, like if I were to push out a social media update, I'm so old, I don't even know the names of these things anymore. If I were to push out like a little 1-sentence social media update, the way that gets to be seen by other people, we think that the only way for that to be seen is if it goes up to the cloud, up to the mothership, and sits in their data store, and then they can coordinate sending it out to everybody else in the world. But we know that that's not actually the way that it has to be. We know we can actually have this distributed and federated and peer-to-peer web. And that update that I send out could go to the people that I've connected with. It doesn't need to go to all the other million, billion people in the world that I don't know and I don't have a relationship with and another connection with. It only needs to go to the people that I care about, that I've already pre-connected with. And we can do that without any cloud store. So first of all, one of the biggest lies is that we need the cloud to coordinate distributed information. And actually, most of that is not needed. I'm not saying there's no need for cloud, but we don't need it for most of what we do. Most of that data does not need to go up to the cloud and then be distributed around the world. And in fact, most of my data doesn't need to go to anybody at all. It's my data. It should stay locally on my device. And it should be easy for me to put that data on all of my devices without it ever going to anybody else. I do not need Google to hold on to all of my data. Google wants my data because they make a shit ton of money off of my data. But I don't need Google's cloud servers to be able to replicate my email and my calendar information between my devices. That's absurd. And we've basically convinced ourselves that that's what we need the cloud for, is to make it so that everything synchronizes and is shared with everybody. So most of that data we don't need to be sending out. What is the cloud still useful for, even in that future model? Well, there are some things that we do want to centralize. Let's take, for example, commerce, right? The notion of buying something from some company. So the thing that that company owns, and really should be the only thing that they own, is the state of the inventory in their warehouse. What shoes they have to sell, what shirts they have to sell, how much they want to charge for it, all of that stuff, that's theirs, that belongs to them. And so they do need a place where they can do that. And you could think of their cloud servers as one peer in this big mesh of all this communication. One of those peers is that they get to own that. That's not my data, and that data shouldn't sit on my device. It's their data. It should stay on their servers, on their systems, right? But they don't need to know very much about me at all as a customer for me to be able to get just the little bits of ephemeral state, like the product ID, the picture, the cost, all of the transaction of that, including all of the payment processing and all that stuff, doesn't actually need to happen to them. All they need to do is just get paid for it. They need to get a bit of information that says, send X product to this person at this time, and they've paid for it. And that's it. So even commerce doesn't need to be so centralized. And if you just really start deconstructing all of the business models that we've built on the web, most of them do not need most of what we put into the cloud. Most of that could actually be done exchanging between peers. And that's the future that I'm hoping that we move towards, where we minimize, I'm not saying we get rid of, but we minimize our dependence on the cloud, and we keep the data that we ought to keep. We should own that data. There should not be any more business models. I'm going to say this firmly. Any business model today that exists because it monetizes my data is a bad, broken business model that should not exist. That company should go out of business or find a different business model. I'm saying that absolutely, because my data should be mine and it should not be somebody else's. And we should not build a web that the only way that web can work is if they can own my data and then make money off of my data by abusing the privilege that I only wanted to buy a shoe from you. Why does that mean that you now forever get to spam me? Like that,
Yeah.
those abuses we baked into the way the web works, and we need to get rid of all of that. And I see something like the web of installed apps and the web of peer-to-peer communications and the web of apps that are kind of local first and local only, and they're very begrudging about sending any data out. And I'm only going to send data out if it absolutely needs to go out. Otherwise, I'm going to hold on to it. Like that's the default way that we should be thinking about how the web is experienced, instead of I go to a web, I type in a domain name or I click a bookmark or something like that. I go to a website, I re-download the whole app, and I have all this fancy, crazy stuff, all these spinners all over the place while it tries to instantly re-update 10 megabytes worth of app data or whatever. And then to participate in whatever that app is doing, I've got to give all of my private data over to some cloud. Like that's the web of today. And that's the web that I'm saying is going to collapse on itself. We need to get rid of that web, and we need to move to this other web that is privacy protecting, this other web that is much more performant, this other web that doesn't need to reinvent so many different wheels to make that stuff happen, that empowers people and really just fundamentally reduces by a significant amount how much data needs to transfer. And by the way, there's a whole part of the world, I don't know if anybody from those parts of the world happens to be listening in on this call, but there's like 2/3 of the world which doesn't have the internet infrastructure. It's collapsing under the weight of all of this damn data that we're sending around. And you got these billionaires who are saying, I'm going to float balloons over the continent of Africa to solve the internet infrastructure problem because we're just sending too much shit. And if we sent so much less data, much more of the world could participate as an equal participant in the web if the web was not so data heavy. That's what I mean by saying the web is collapsing in on itself, because we literally have parts of the world that can't participate in what we in the privileged first world get to participate in. They can't participate in that, and they should be able to be equal participants in it. And that's another reason why I think we need to a radical course correction, if you will, from the web of today to what I see is a coming web that's much different and I think much better.
What's the crossovers with the work that you're doing at Socket Supply with the blockchain movement?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of people think when you start talking about this new web, you must be talking about Web 3. My previous employer, before I joined Socket recently, the previous employer, I spent 5 or 6 months working at a Web3 company, a crypto company, a company that does smart contracts in the Bitcoin space. The company's called Hiro, Hiro. It's a great company, great people. Does this mean that the next version of the web is the version of the web that the world of crypto and smart contracts is envisioning. And they've co-opted the term Web3. I'm not going to try to take control of the Web3 moniker back from them. There are people that are trying to redefine Web3 to mean the web of virtual reality or the web of AI or whatever. I'm not trying to do that. So let them have the label Web3. I'm talking about Web 2.5. Okay. I'm talking about something in between where we are now and where we maybe someday, I'm not saying for sure, but maybe someday we start to realize some of the really, I think, important and useful and probably really good things that Web3 might bring about someday. But I'm just convinced that we're not ready for that world yet. They're building a bunch of stuff and they're going to be ready for us when we're ready for them, but we're not ready for that world yet. And so what we need to do is build a different web in between, and that's web, I'll call it 2.5. It is much friendlier and much more aligned with the goals of Web3. But one of the, I can't talk about Web3 without saying that one of the biggest problems with Web3 is that it is co-opted by the greed of currency right now. And Web3 will never be something that is important and that matters and that changes the trajectory of the web until we move away from thinking about Web3 as only what can happen with cryptocurrencies. We need to move to the world of the blockchain and of smart contracts and things like that. And that's why I worked for a company that was trying to do that, that was trying to bring about better smart contract ecosystem. That is the part of that. You know, we've got this giant beast of what is Web3 and blockchain and crypto. Most of that, I think, is bullshit. Honestly, my personal opinion is that most of that is bullshit. But there is some of that a tiny chunk of that is actually super promising and is actually super useful. And that is, I think, going to factor into the future, or I hope it factors in to the future of the web. We're not ready to go there yet, but I see what I'm talking about as a step along that spectrum, or a step along the way in that direction. But we're going to have to, for Web3 to ever really factor into the future of the web, it's going to have to come into its own as a thing about not just currency and not just people trying to manipulate currencies. So I don't know if that'll ever happen. I hope it does, because I think there's a lot of really positive stuff there. But when I talk about what I'm building and what Socket's building, I don't think that you should lump that in with whatever good or bad you think about Web3. It's, you know, push that out on your horizon by 10 or 20 years. What we need to build for the next 10 or 20 years is Web 2.5. It's the web of peer-to-peer, federated, installable apps. That's what we need.
So with this peer-to-peer federated installed apps, is there going to have to be a shift in mindset of the people using those apps? You know, the apps that we download today, obviously they're huge and take a long time to download, but most things are instant in terms of, you know, you get the data from the server, it computates something for you, and it gives you an instant result or instant news feed. With these Web 2.5 apps, are you still going to be able to get that same feedback loop when interacting with your app?
I think we do need to potentially change a few things about user habits and user perceptions. So I think that's an astute question. One of the things that we need to change or alter or adjust or help evolve in user perceptions and habits is around identity management, secrets and identity management. We need to move beyond I have to come up with a new password for every damn website that I interact with. And we need to move to a world where identity management is much more solid. There's a million companies that claim that they know what the next version after passwords is. But right now, the web's not interested in one single answer to that question. And so users are just kind of constantly exhausted by, okay, God, I've got another thing that I got to do, or LastPass got hacked, so now I got to move all my shit over to some other like password manager or whatever. And I think generally non-technical users are pretty exhausted by the fact that this can't just be a solved thing. We're going to need to solve that, the identity and the secrets management stuff. I have some ideas for how that might happen, and how it might happen through this this installed web of federated apps, this peer-to-peer web. One example of that is that the peer-to-peer web, that part of the way that it works at the protocol level is that you are basically saying with your device that participates, whether it's your phone or your laptop or a server, whatever device it is that you join to that network of peer-to-peer communications, you are agreeing to allow some of your system's resources to be shared by the collective network. And I know right off the bat, everybody's like, oh my God, you're going to do Bitcoin mining with my computer. No, that's not what I mean. I don't mean that you're really sharing compute, but I do mean that you're sharing some memory and some storage stuff, resources, because the web of peer-to-peer and federated and installed apps is an ephemeral web. It's not a web that's based upon static IP addresses of, your cloud instances. It's not a web that's based upon static IP addresses that sit in DNS records. It's based upon an ephemeral web where devices are constantly popping online and offline and online and offline all over the place, trillions of them a second popping online and offline. And every time they pop online, they may have a different network address. They may have a different network topology. They may be behind a router for one moment and now they're not behind a router, all of that. So we have to stop thinking about this as like a fixed topology internet and start thinking about it as this really shifting ephemeral thing. And part of the way that works, and part of the reason why sockets protocols for peer-to-peer are going to be so important, is that you've got to make sure that if you send out some information, you're briefly online with your ephemeral connection to this mesh of connectedness, the peer-to-peer mesh. You send out some packets of information because you're trying to send a message to somebody, or you're trying to say, I want to order a shirt or whatever, and you may immediately go offline. And the person that you need to send that information to, or the company that you need to send that information to, also might not have been online at that time. So we need to stop thinking about the web as like this fixed static TCP synchronous connections, back into the idea of this asymmetric and asynchronous kind of connection. And that's what the protocol builds in, is that your packets go from your device to the next peer in the mesh, the one that you're most directly connected to. Even if your packets are not meant for them, they are encrypted, but they are on that person's, in their memory or in their storage, until such a time as they can rebroadcast it to somebody else who can then rebroadcast it. And eventually those packets get there. Now that may seem like it's going to take a long time for a message to get somewhere. The length of time for it to get to where it needs to go is directly proportional to how connected this mesh is and how much online it is. But if you see this future where we have millions and millions of connected nodes that are all talking to each other, you can still get near instantaneous transmission of those packets jumping from peer to peer to peer in the same way that those packets jump through all of the fixed internet infrastructure today. They take 15, 20, 100 hops through internet infrastructure. We just start thinking about those hops as happening through peer devices instead of through, all these fixed routers and cloud servers and all this other stuff. But you can still get your data to go pretty quickly. But if you happen to be very disconnected from the person that you're sending the information to, if you're in very different parts of the web and there's no really direct routes and connections, there might be some delay. Maybe a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. And in fact, they're not going to get that information at all until they're online. And if they're not online now, you just need to accept the fact that what you sent them is not at their device until they come back online. They come back online, they broadcast out, hey, I'm back online and I'm looking for packets. Who's got information for me? And within a few seconds or maybe a minute, those packets will have made their way from the mesh back out to their device. But one of those things that we need to change about user perception is that things are these fixed, instantaneous, synchronous connections. We need to move to the kind of the eventual consistency of this network is that it'll make sure your packets get there. It'll be stored on 3,000 to 5,000 other people's devices at any given second or in millisecond, and eventually the packets that you need to get there will get there. And the only way that they don't get there is if you or them are offline for like a month. If you're offline for that long, then I'm sorry, your data didn't live long enough. It didn't survive long enough. But as long as you and the person that you're trying to communicate with are temporarily online, once a day, you're gonna get
the
your
modern
data.
world, right? Yeah, no one's gonna go offline.
Everybody, but
days.
very few people are going to be persistently disconnected from that network in the way where data would get lost, if you will. Where you're going to get the data, but we don't expect, for when people shut their phones off because they're in the movie theater or whatever, or they're on a plane and they put it in airplane mode, we don't expect to be able to get them that data, right? We expect that data comes to them when they connect back. So that's not actually that weird or new of a notion. We're just saying that we should actually change user perception around secrets and identity management. That needs to become your ultimate responsibility. It shouldn't be so hard. There are ways for that to happen. And I mentioned this sort of, what if your secrets management is actually based upon that same network? Instead of needing LastPass to store all of your secrets, what if your encrypted store of all your secrets, which only you can make use of any of those bits of data, only your device can decrypt that? But what if that's just temporarily stored on thousands of other people's devices? It'll never go away, because if that network stays alive, those packets will always be there. And anytime you come back online, you'll get all of your packets back. You'll have all of your secrets back, but only your device can make sense of that. And what if we just all agreed that we collectively share the burden to keep that stuff alive so that everybody can participate? That's one possible shift in the thinking that goes away from centralized servers storing all of our passwords.
Oh, and so I presume that selling this idea to the masses is about showcasing the downsides of the current web, where companies have all your data and they share that data. And yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
To that point, I would say, speaking on behalf of Socket, I don't think our thought process is around right now trying to convince users. We're going to convince the companies that build these experiences that they could build better experiences that get way more done, that do it much more efficiently and faster. They create better experiences for their users without paying those huge cloud bills. So I think it'll be the businesses who will convince their users that this new way of interacting is better by the choices that they make. So Socket is really not trying to go convince every single internet, 8 billion internet users to all overnight change what they do. What we're going to do is change the way that businesses create experiences. We're going to make that be much more effective, and they will create compelling experiences that will draw users in. You will want to, as a user, do it the way that business is doing it, because you will see all of those benefits that you talked about. Like, you'll see that you get to own your data, and you get to have privacy, and you get to have much more efficiency, and there gets to be just a whole lot less data, and things update a lot faster. You're going to see all of those benefits because the businesses decided that that's the experience they wanted to create. And I'm using business here in a broad sense, not just commerce, but like anybody that runs a blog is going to be able to do this better by delivering their information through that approach rather than through the way the web currently works. And so eventually I think users will pick up on, oh, this is better. This is the way it always should have been. I think users like app stores anyway. And so I don't think convincing users to install apps is going to be as challenging as maybe we might assume. I think there's a lot of built-in trust that comes from installing something that's been reviewed and been signed, and I know exactly what it is, versus just a drive-by of some random website that showed up in my Google search, and I don't know if they're like all of a sudden, storing all kinds of cookies on my device or whatever. I think users already will inherently trust apps that are built in this way, and I think companies don't have to they don't have to choose. It is important to note that we're still talking about web technology here. that's building these apps. And so they don't have to choose right now. They can build these alongside, they can build these experiences alongside of their more traditional web experiences, and then eventually convince their users that the installed app experience is much better. And I think that users will shift that way.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts there, Carl. We wanted to get into your new programming language, Foy. I think we're running a little bit out of time, but if you could share some thoughts on that, and then we can summarize.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned that I was starting to go through this mental shift on what the web is and what I want the web to be in the future and what role I think I can play in that. For a long time, for 2 decades now, my thought has been my role is to help evangelize and help people learn and understand and use JavaScript better. I am not saying right now that I'm abandoning JavaScript, that JavaScript is dead, that we should get rid of JavaScript. I think it will continue to play a pivotal role indefinitely into the future. And I think it plays a pivotal role in the future of the web, even the web of installed apps like I'm talking about. So we're still using web technology. I don't want you to think that this is like some switcheroo where we're gonna abandon all the technology that you already know. But I personally think that the JavaScript language is not serving the kinds of patterns and usages that I think engineers really need to be able to write better quality programs. And for a long time, I've been trying to advocate and evangelize and encourage and kind of, shoulder my way into getting JavaScript to change in ways that I think will improve that. And I think I just realized like that's a losing battle. Speaking personally here, like I've spent 20 years learning and understanding, and I've participated in from as an outsider in as many different ways, the different parts of the standardization process around JavaScript as I can possibly have hoped to do as an individual. And I have a perfect track record of 0 wins and thousands of losses, if you will. I've never once been able to get any single idea that I advocated for to change the trajectory of what JavaScript is. I'm not saying that I should have been able to, but it's just a fact that I haven't been able to change JavaScript. All I've been able to do, and I think I've been pretty successful at, is help people understand what JavaScript is and what they can do with what JavaScript is. But I haven't been able to change the trajectory of JavaScript in any meaningful way, other than that I've helped onboard many more people into JavaScript. So I've had those indirect effects on the language and the trajectory of JavaScript. But I just started realizing that maybe it's a foolish notion for an individual like me to think that I ever could have changed anything about JavaScript. Maybe that's just a silly notion. And so maybe JavaScript doesn't need to change to create an environment that I would like to exist and the kind of code that I would like to write. Maybe JavaScript doesn't need to change to do that. And that's why last summer I just decided to start what I consider to be a long-term kind of passion project of mine, which is take all of these ideas about things that I've been trying to change and alter about JavaScript and just put them into a new language. Design a new language from scratch that I think solves many of the problems that I've been frustrated with about JavaScript. And the reason why that's not a negative thing for JavaScript is that we, over the last several years, have embraced the idea that the web can actually be built on more than just JavaScript through the advent of WASM. We have many, many more languages that are showing up and participating in web applications that are written in Go and C++ and lots of other kinds of languages. And that's the avenue that I'm going to go with Foy, F-O-I. It's a language that I've purposely designed to embrace both functional programming and the people that are kind of unfamiliar or uncomfortable with it, so it kind of bridges the gap. It's a language that's designed to empower people. I've got a lot of big ideas on how I think I'm going to be able to do that. But ultimately, it's a language that I think joins the ecosystem rather than tries to replace anything. I'm not trying to compete with Rust. I'm not trying to compete with JavaScript. I'm not trying to compete with Python or any of these other languages. I'm just trying to add to that mix another choice. And so eventually, out in some far future, if I'm successful at getting Foy to come into existence, I hope that maybe you could choose Foy as the language that you wrote some of the app logic that then joined the other app logic that you were building in this web of installable apps. And so maybe there is a future where Foy becomes part of what you could target. It's not a guarantee, and designing a new language takes years. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I've done a lot of work on the design, and true to form, I'm doing it all in the open, unlike many languages which are kind of designed behind closed doors by a small. It's all out in the open. You can go and check it out on my GitHub repo, and you can say it sucks, or you can say this is awesome, or you can say, hey, what if you did this differently? It's all open to input. But it's a project of mine where I basically decided, instead of complaining about JavaScript, and I felt like maybe I've done more than my fair share of complaining. I tried to balance it by also being a big proponent of JavaScript. So I tried to bring both of those energies to the mix. But I really just got tired of the negativity and feeling bad about myself, that every single time I tried to make something different about JavaScript and it didn't, I felt bad about myself, and I felt frustrated. And I just decided to get rid of that negativity and say it's okay for JavaScript to be what it wants to be. I'll have my opinions on what's good and maybe what's not great about JavaScript, but my answers to that don't have to be complaining about JavaScript anymore. My answers can be, here's something else that you might consider. And if one other person ever finds any benefit out of the stuff I've done with Foy, then that would have been, a worthwhile effort. So that's what the language is about.
You talk about WebAssemblies. Is Foy something that compiles to WebAssembly, or is it transpiled into JavaScript?
No, it will compile directly to WASM. There is no compiler yet. I'm still in the language design phase, and solidifying all of that stuff. But when there is a compiler, it will compile to WASM, which means you can run Foy in a website. You can run Foy in a web application like a socket application. You can run Foy on a server. You can run Foy anywhere that WASM can run, which is basically anywhere. WASM is becoming the new JVM. It's the new universal virtual machine. And so that's why Foy is going to just compile directly to WASM.
Great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I think we'll call it a day here. We've been on here for quite a while.
Yeah.
You said you've got your talk on the 31st of March in London. So anybody that's watching, grab some tickets and come and see Kyle talk about Web 2.5 or 2.5.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, the Web 2.5 or 2.5 or whatever. Yeah, and bring your oranges if you want to throw them at me because you think that what I'm saying is heresy. That's okay. But
tomatoes.
It's not worth it to me to talk about something if it's not going to push the envelope in some way. And so this is the way I think the web needs to evolve, and we'll see how that happens. I'm sure it won't be like I've suggested. I'm sure it'll be a lot different. But I think we need to ask those questions about the web. Can it change? Should it change? And how can it? How do we need to change it? And I hope that maybe this talk will help start pushing that conversation.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Kyle. It's been great chatting with you.
It's been great, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day. See you all.
Yep.
Take care.